Do you find tattoo needles confusing? How to read them? Which ones should you use and why? Hey, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you everything that you need to know about tattoo needles, from understanding all the differences between the types of needles, how to read the label of the tattoo needle, and what all the different terminology means, like needle count, taper, gauges, or needle diameters. When you first start learning how to tattoo, looking at different needles can just be a complete mind boggle, which, if that's how you feel right now, then please don't worry, you're definitely not on your own, and I were exactly the same. However, by the end of this video, you'll have a clear understanding of everything to do with tattoo needles. In fact, I dare say that you'll understand them enough that you'd be able to teach someone else all about tattoo needles. When I first started learning how to tattoo, I found understanding needles very, very complicated. I did what most people do, and that was search up every video that I could possibly find on YouTube that discussed the topic and watch them until my eyes bled. Now, if I'm honest, half the time I felt more confused after watching some videos than beforehand. So just let me quickly explain how this video is going to actually work. I'm going to explain and show you all the different factors of the tattoo needles. Basically what is involved in making up a tattoo needle step by step. Don't worry, this will all make sense soon. Doing it in this way means that as soon as you see any tattoo needle, you fully understand every aspect of it and therefore can determine what its uses are or are not. At the end of the video, I'm going to give you a little quiz that I'll gladly tell you almost 100% of people will get all answers correct. So let's jump straight into it. Right, so let's start talking about needles and making sense of it. It's confusing when you first start, but hopefully after this little demonstration lesson, everything will make sense and you'll be able to look at any needle from any suppliers, know exactly what all numbers mean. And once you've understood the different aspects of needles, you'll be able to work out for yourself, right, I'm doing this particular tattoo, this is the type of needle that I want, and this is how it's going to affect skin. But just listen to what I've got to say. Some bits might not sink in straight away, but just try and accept what I'm saying and don't overthink it. I can remember when I first started looking at all different needles, it can be a mind boggle. And if you try and overthink everything, you'll just confuse yourself. So we're going to take it step by step and hopefully everything will make sense. So typically you're going to see a tattoo needle and it's going to have a bunch of numbers on it. So this, we've got a 1203 RLST. All right, so what does these numbers actually mean? So if you've got a pen and paper, you might want to start jotting these down. So the first number, in this instance 12, is the diameter or the gauge. All right, then we've got the second number, again 03 in this instance, which is your needle count. We're going to explain all these individually, but it's just an overview to start with. Then we've got the third, which is RL, that's the configuration. And then the last one, they don't always have these on. Again, it depends on manufacturer. ST, which this is referring to the taper of the needle. Now some of these you might think, well, I've no idea what that is. By the end of the video you will. But they're the 4 different aspects of the needle that we're going to be discussing. Okay, so as we've said, the first number, which in this instance is 12, refers to the diameter or the gauge. All right, so a 12 gauge, which is what we've got, is 0.35 millimeter. 10 gauge is a 0.3, 8 gauge is a 0.25. Now these two here are often referred to as bug pins. Now the diameter, the first number, is referring to each individual needle. So as you can see, the thickness of the needle is the diameter or the gauge, and it's the individual needles. So if we've got a 12 gauge, which is 0.35 millimeters, that would be this little diagram. And you can see that the thickness of each individual needle would be 0.35 mil, or a 12 gauge. If we had a 10 gauge needle, so this first number were a 10, then the thickness of each individual needle is going to be slightly smaller at 0.3 millimeters. And then again, even further, if we had an 8 gauge, which depending on manufacturers, they're both often referred to as a bug pin needle because they're thinner, is a 0.25. So that's a typical needle bar. We can see it's got 3 needles on. These are just zoomed in versions of each individual needle. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense. So just for a second, imagine what effect is that going to have on somebody's skin and the running of the machine. So if we're using a thicker needle, there might be 3 of them, there might be 15. It's going to pierce a bigger hole because the needle's thicker. It's also like if you've got a really thin pin, you could push it into somebody's skin. But if you've got a thick nail, it's going to take a lot more force to push that into somebody's skin, isn't it? So the machine is going to have to run different to compensate for that. It's going to need more force to push it in. So if we were using a 0.25 or an 8 gauge, it's not going to need as much force to penetrate the skin and to push the ink in. If you're using thicker needles, so a 12 gauge, which is often referred to as a standard, you're going to need more impact, more force to drive that needle to pierce the skin and push the ink in. There's other things that also you've got to take into account, not just the diameter or the gauge. As we get onto tapers later on, that also has a big effect on how easy something goes into the skin. But let's just take it slow. The first number refers to the diameter or the gauge, and that is the thickness of each individual needle. So again, if you've got your pen and paper, you might want to just jot them down, pause it. So again, I've already briefly mentioned it. The first number in this instance is a 12 gauge. That's referring to the diameter or the gauge. Both mean the same thing. 12 is a 0.35. It's referred to as the standard in the tattoo industry. Now both of these can be referred to as a bug pin. It never has bug pin written on any of the packaging, but you'll often hear artists say, I use bug pins. It's one or the other of these. All right, so next, in this instance, we've got a 3, but this is the needle count. You can get even numbers, but more often than not, the most popular and most common is a single, 3, 5, etc. All right, it refers to the total number of individual needles. So let's just rewind a little bit. The first number refers to the thickness of each individual needle, the gauge, the diameter. The second number refers to how many needles there actually is. So if we were using a 3, that means there's 3 individual needles within that needle. And then next, this would be a 5. As you can see, there's 5 individual needles. Therefore, if we were using a 9 Magnum, which we're going to get to shortly, that means there'd be 9 individual needles. A 15 Magnum would have 15. Therefore, you can tell just by looking at the numbers, one's going to be a lot bigger than the others because there's more needles there. All right, so that's quite a simple one to explain. Now, there's absolutely tons of these. So we've got the diameter, the gauge. We've got how many needles there actually is. Next is the configuration. Now, there's loads of these. This is where it does actually start to get a little bit complicated because, again, depending on the brand that you use or the manufacturer, the company that creates them, they label these up slightly different. So yours might actually be slightly different to this, but it'll give you the rough idea. They're all very, very similar, and it's self-explanatory to work it out once you've got a general understanding. So an RL refers to as round liner. And if you can see these dots, that's what it's referring to. There's 3 dots, 3 needles, and that's the shape that it takes. It's also the exact same for the round shader, although there is a difference, which we're going to get to shortly. F is just a flat, and that's just a single row of needles in a line. Next we've got a magnum, or M1, and there's 2 rows and they're stacked upon each other. So as you can see, they create that shape. That's like a bird's eye view looking at the tips of the needles. If you look at it side on, you can see it's just a flat magnum, so they all finish in a straight line. All right. Then we've got M1C, which is curved mag, or RM, which again is a curved mag, or referred to as a round mag. The difference between these is the needles are in the exact same shape, apart from instead of finishing flat, they finish curved. So if we're thinking about this as in how that's going to affect the skin, well, imagine that this is somebody's skin. All right? When you're forcing something, obviously the skin moves. But I've never seen anybody's skin move like a fucking robot, perfectly squared. It just naturally curves in and creates a curve in the skin itself. So me personally, I always think a curved magnum is going to be less traumatic to skin and actually get better coverage because of how the skin moves. Again, if we were using a straight magnum, we can see that that'd also have some benefits as well, because you'd be able to use the corners of the mag a lot easier than you would a curved mag. All right. So, last one obviously refers to taper. In this instance, it's ST. Now, ST stands for short taper, ST, at 1.5 mil. Again, depending on the manufacturers, these numbers may vary, but you'd understand exactly what they are and you'd be able to see what it actually means. Then we've got a long taper at 2 mil, double long taper, DLT, and that's 2.5 mil. The standard is the short taper at 1.5. It's often referred to as a standard taper. So what does the taper actually mean? Well, you've got your needle, and at the end where it starts to taper to a point, the distance between that, so there's your needle bar, the distance it goes refers to the taper of the needle. So it is pretty self-explanatory. You've got your 2.5, your 2, and then your standard, your 1.5. So the short, medium, and the longer. But why is that important? Well, again, if we think back to the gauge or the diameter of a needle, the smaller the needle is that you're trying to force into somebody's skin, the less pressure it's going to require. So you'll be able to run your machine softer and a bit slower. The taper, obviously not all 2.5 millimeters is necessarily going to be going into the skin. So if it will go in roughly there, say, depending on the body part that you tackle in, the skin's always going to be different thicknesses, and between different customers. It's going to be, let's say, half, just for an example. You're only pushing in that very small needle. On a shorter taper, if we pushed it in that same distance, it's instantly to the full thickness of the needle itself. So again, not only is each individual dot going to be ever so slightly smaller, it's also going to require less effort for the machine to put it in. However, if you're wanting to pack colour in, you'd want the needle to be slightly thicker and possibly a shorter taper, so it really pushes the ink in. If you were going to do something realistic, you want a really soft gradual blends, then you're going to want a smaller dot and thinner, less effort to put in, but not packing the ink in as much. So we're going to go for a thinner gauge because the needle overall is thinner. Then we could have a long taper, so it's even less that's going to be going into the skin. That's going to make each dot really small, and it's going to be really soft as you tattoo in. So hopefully this is making sense. So straight away, just looking at these, you can also start to preempt what needles are good for. If you want to really pack it in, you'd go for a specific needle. If you're wanting soft shading or blending together, then you're going to go for a different needle again. So let's just have a little discussion. We've got a 1003 RL. So that's a 10 gauge. There's 3 needles and it's a round liner. All right. Then we've got a 1203 RL. So it's the exact same needle other than this first number, the gauge, the diameter. So as we can see, these are smaller because it's a smaller size needle. These are bigger. So the gap in between is going to be slightly bigger. And the individual points that it actually makes are also going to be thinner. Then we've got the difference between the RL, the round liner, and the exact same needle but a round shader. Now, without looking at the bottom bits, everything is the exact same. However, for a liner, the needles almost come to a point and it almost like pinches and traps the ink into a concentrated area. Whereas the round shader, instead of the needles coming to a point, they just go straight in and out. So it's obviously the gap in between them is slightly bigger, therefore it's easier to shade with that needle. It's not concentrating the ink into just one area. Then again, we've got a 12, 15, so a standard. There's 15 needles and it's a curved magnum. So if we look at the distance of this one, we can see the gaps in between are going to be slightly bigger because they're thicker needles, and it's overall going to be a wider needle. If we compare that to the 10 gauge, 15 curved magnum, they're going to be smaller needles, less gaps in between, so it's actually going to be smaller. The same amount of needles, just smaller and closer together. So typically, if I were wanting to pack some colour in, or a big area of solid black, for example, I'd choose this needle. These are smaller, they don't push the ink in as quick, but they're better for shading and softer work. So if I were doing a portrait, I'd go for a bug pin, just to really get them soft blends. Okay, so hopefully everything's been making sense to you, but I want to have a little test. There's no better way to make sure that you're digesting information and that you fully understand it than testing yourself at end. So there's no pressure. I'm going to give you a needle. If you jot these down and then just put a tick at the one that you think I'm saying. So let's start with, I'm wanting a 10 gauge 5 liner. A 10 gauge 5 liner. So which one of these is it? If you guess this one, then you're right. Next, I want a standard 18 round shader. A standard 18 round shader. So if you think back, the standard refers to as a 12 gauge or a 0.35. So if you put a tick next to that one, perfect. Next, I want a standard 9 flat. Nice and easy one because it's only one up there that's a flat. So if you put a tick next to this one, well done. Next, I want a standard single liner. a standard single liner down here. So if you put a tick next to this one, well done. Right, I'm going to try and confuse you with this one. Next, I want a bug pin 7 curved mag. A bug pin 7 curved mag. So if we think back, the bug pin can refer to an 8 or a 10 gauge, a 0.25 or a 0.3 mil. So we've got an 08, 07 curved mag. There's no other bug pins that's a curved magnum and a 7. Alright, the next one, I'm wanting a bug pin 11 liner. Alright, so I'm guessing you're jumping straight at these now. It's down here. How many we've got left? Last two, nice and simple. A standard 15 curved mag. So if you think back, the RM, round mag, or the M1C, they're just labelled different, they're actually meaning the same thing. And then last one, it can either be referred to as an 8 gauge 15 curved mag or a bug pin 15 curved mag. So if you had to really think about them, majority of you will have, but as long as you come to end result and got it right, if you didn't, then just jump back to the beginning of the video and just recap them all. But it's really important to be taking notes. So if we just jump back onto this first page, we've got a 1203 round liner standard taper. The first number is the diameter or the gauge. The second one, the needle count. The RL in this instance. The third one, configuration. And then finally, taper. I'm just going to quickly recap them, but hopefully you should be almost saying it along with me, what each one means. So the diameter or the gauge refers to what? The thickness of each individual needle. The needle count refers to how many needles are there actually to create that needle. So it might be a 3 liner where there's 3 needles, a 5, whatever it may be. The next is the configuration, which refers to the pattern of how the needles are. So is it a liner where they all come to a point? Is it a flat where it's just an individual row of needles? Is it a magnum where they're stacked in 2 rows? Is it a curved magnum where the tips are curved, or is it flat? All right. And then finally, taper is the distance where the needle starts to actually come to a point. How long is that? That's the taper. So hopefully it's all a little bit clearer now. If you're wanting to pack colour in, you'd want a slightly bigger needle, so a shorter taper possibly, and a thicker gauge. That's going to really push the ink in. But it also means that it's going to take more force to get the needle in the skin, so therefore you might have to up your machine, possibly slow your hand down a little bit. Or are we wanting to do a really nice soft blend where we'd want smaller individual needles so it's less trauma to skin? It doesn't pack the ink in as fast, but it allows us to get them smooth, buttery blends. And then obviously common sense stuff, lines. All this applies to a liner as well. If you're wanting a really big, bold line, you might want a 12 gauge short taper because you really want to push that ink in. Or you wanting a really thin, crisp line, more for putting details in rather than big, bold, like traditional work. Then you'd use maybe a bug pin and a longer taper. So once you understand each of these and
what they actually do and what they mean, it allows you to decide what needles you want. You could look at a design and say, right, I want this needle, and understand why. And I think that's really important. I know that when I first started, my brain works, well, why do you need that? What effect would that have? Why that one over this one? And once you understand these 4 points, you almost can answer yourself. So hopefully that made sense.
Well done for making it to the end of the video. I hope that you gained as much as you can and that you feel a lot more confident when it comes to reading tattoo needles. If you didn't know already, I've got a full course that teaches you how to tattoo from complete beginner right up to a professional standard. I'll leave all information in the description below. You can also try it for completely free for 30 days as well, which again, I'll put all the information for that in the description. Other than that, I hope you all have a really nice day and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.